Welcome back. What we're going to be looking at today is we're going to be looking at cubic factorisation, and we've got a couple of examples up here. We've got a nice simple one where we can just factorise a common term out, and then we've got a little bit more detailed one. And we're going to look at the detailed one a little bit more after we do the simple one, and look at some new terms that are going to come into play. So let's look at this first one here. We've got x cubed minus 2x squared minus 8x. So we've got x cubed minus 2x squared minus 8x. First thing we're going to look at when we ever want to factorise something is, well, what's common that I can actually factorise out? Well, in this case here, x is common in each of the terms, so I can bring that x out. So I'll have x. If I factorise 1x out of everything, I end up with x squared minus 2x minus 8. And now I have a quadratic here that I know that I can actually factorise a little bit further, because I have that knowledge of null factor law. So if I bring this down, I'm going to have x, and then I have two brackets here for my other factors. So two numbers that multiply to give negative 8, that multiply to give negative 8, and add to give negative 2 would be, let's see, positive 6 and, what would I say, positive 6? Let's say negative, oh, let's have a look at this here. No, it's going to be negative 4 and positive 2. And let's double check that. Negative 4 times positive 2 is negative 8. Negative 4 plus 2 is negative 2. So therefore, here would be my answer. I've factorised this answer down into its factors. X minus 4, x plus 2. I'm not going to solve that. Alright. Before we get to the second example, let's look at a couple of terms that you're going to be using here. And these terms are called zeros, roots, and polynomial equality. Okay, so what do these things all mean? So basically, a zero is when you're making the equation a polynomial equals 0. So when a number that makes, so we'll say a value that makes the polynomial equals 0. So a value that makes the polynomial equal to 0. So I'm going to plug a number into x here, and if that number gives me 0, then I know that value is actually a 0 for that number. A root is a solution to a solution. Okay? So for instance, if we said let's plug in 1 in here. If I get the answer as 0, then I would know that 1 is a 0 for that equation. Where if we had x plus 1 is equal to 0, then x equals negative 1 is a root. Where if I had y is equal to 0, I've got some kind of 0 value here. Similarly, if we had, let's say, 2x minus 1 is equal to 0, then we'd get x is equal to 1/2, and this here would also be a root. So if I was going to draw a graph, for instance, I could work out what my roots are going to be when I equate them to 0. So here, this is when y is equal to 0, I get the root, I get a root, I get a root, which aligns with what you've been working out already. And another word for the roots would be solutions. What about polynomial equality? Well, polynomial equality is a little bit different. For polynomial equality to work, we have to be able to equate the equation with two unknown types of equations. For cubics, those two equations are a linear factor multiplied with a quadratic factor. So basically what we're doing here is we're just equating the product of these two against what the original function is. But the key here is we don't know what these values are. So we could have x plus a multiplied by bx squared plus cx plus d. And by using polynomial equality, I can actually equate these parts against what I have here to work out what these unknown variables are going to be. So let's have a look at one, finding a zero that I can use to turn into a factor. That would give me some value here. So let's look at this here. How do we do that? Well, let's have a look back at a quadratic. If I had the quadratic of, say, x squared, let's have one we had before, which was x squared minus 2x squared minus 8x, and we ended up getting that value of x, or x cubed, so x squared minus, oh let's write it here, minus 2x. We'll do that here. We'll just write it here. X squared minus 2x minus 8. I knew that I would get x and x by looking at this and going, well, what two numbers multiply? What are the factors of negative 8? I'm going to do the same thing in this part here. I'm going to ask myself, well, what are all the factors of negative 8? So I can have positive negative 1, positive negative 2, positive negative 4, or positive negative 8. And what I want to do here is I want to substitute this value in to one of these functions, so therefore I can actually work out what the answer is going to be. So I'm taking a possible zero and tell me, would that number be a zero when I plug it in? So for instance, let's call this here f of x, okay? And I want to plug in, instead of this, I'm going to plug 1 in and see if I get the answer of 0. So 1 cubed minus 5 times 1 squared plus 2 times 1 plus 8. If I look at that here, I'm going to get 1 take away 5 is negative 4, plus 2 is negative, so I'm going to get 6. So that does not give me 0. So therefore, as x does not equal 0, we can say that 1, which if we look at this here as a factor, x minus 1 is not a factor. That gives me 0. So we try the next thing. We'll look and go, well, let's try negative 1. So if we had negative 1, we'd have negative 1 cubed minus 5 times negative 1 squared plus 2 times negative 1 plus 8. Now if I was going to look at this here, I get negative 1 plus 5 minus 2 plus 8. That indeed does give me 0. So therefore, x plus 1 is a factor. And what I've got here is, I've got my first part. So remember, to find a factor, I need a linear factor. And I need to multiply that with some quadratic factor. Well, I've got my linear factor here, x plus 1. So I've got my linear factor. Now I need to be able to multiply that with some form of quadratic factor. So let's erase this part and start looking at, well, what do I know of? Well, I know that this here is going to be equal to x plus 1, because I've worked out that's a factor, but I need a quadratic factor. Well, I don't know what that quadratic factor is. But what I do know is that a quadratic is made up of these three variables.